Good morning, everybody. I think it's still morning. We're running a little bit late, but the good news is that, good and bad news is we're missing one of the panelists, so we will have more time to for the presenters and also for the discussions. My name is Abdullah Baaboud. I'm from Qatar University. And I'm delighted for the invitation to chair this session on Weberian state and its challenges. Many of you, I don't need to explain to you what Weber had claimed, that the state, that it is a system of administration and law, and and he explained it that it's modified by the state law, which guides collective action and run by executive staff, and it's regulated by statutes, etc. He claims that the state claims authority over its members and associations, and with a broader scope over all action taken at that place or over a territory. And basically the state kind of has domination over its territory and also over the use of force. So the theory itself, the Weber state, or what is also known as Neo-Weberian state, claims a number of things. One is that it claims a system and an administration of administrational law. It's a symbol also of collective action for the general public. It's a modern state that exercises power over the community and over its association. It's also independent and capable of taking decisions and selecting preferences and taking action within its autonomy and territory. So basically, a state is a collective body which has coercive power and also has a monopoly of legitimate use of physical force. And he also talks about how the bureaucracy in the states. However, having said that, many people would say that this is a very interesting idea, 19th century idea, etc. And also it is a theory that came from his own experience in the European context. Here we are talking about the Indian Ocean, about different experiences in terms of space and time. And does that theory still apply? Do we still have the Weberian state as it was envisaged then? And is the liberal state still exist? There are challenges. We've heard this morning some of those challenges, like migration, technological innovation, social network, devolution of power. Democracy doesn't mean the central government still exists in the way it is. There is vertical and horizontal devolution of power, as we have seen it in certain areas. And there is also shared governance and public management reforms that does not necessarily support the theory as it came there and then. So with this kind of quick introduction, we have we're supposed to be 3 prominent speakers, and we apologize for our third speaker, Steffen Hertog from LSE, who couldn't make it due to illness, but we have 2 prominent speakers here, and I'm going to start with Professor, let me make sure I got the, with Anatol Lieven from Georgetown University. I'm not sure if you want me to read you his bio, but it suffices to say that it is here in the handout, and he's someone who doesn't need much introduction. a prominent scholar at Georgetown and has great interest in foreign policy, international security, diplomacy, especially in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia. And he is the author of numerous books, including Pakistan Hard Country and American Right or Wrong, or is America Right and Wrong, and Anatomy of American Nationalism, and Ukrainian-Russian federal rivalry that he published in 1999. Anatol will be speaking today about the Pakistan case?
Actually, I'll speak more generally about
More generally. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and welcome everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. I wasn't actually supposed to be talking on this panel at all originally, and now, of course, the panel itself has shrunk radically. So I thought what I'd do is try to throw out, since there's also more time available, some general, provocative, hopefully interesting, maybe not, ideas about the purpose of this conference in general, the title and what we're talking about. I was very struck from that point of view by something that Professor Blom-Hansen said in his remarks about how in South Asia nothing ever goes away. I was going to begin my own talk with a more pretentious version of that statement, extended more widely in the world. Ernst Bloch's dictum of the uncontemporaneity of the contemporaneous. It sounds even better in German. Die Ungleichzeitigkeit des Gleichzeitigen. Des Gleichzeitigen. And in South Asia especially, what this reflects is that to a superficial view, or indeed not a superficial view, you have coexisting together state forms, elements of political behavior, political organization, economic organization, of course, which look strikingly modern, although whenever I say modern in the course of this talk, one should add inverted commas, coexisting beside other extremely powerful elements that look extremely old and appear, at least, to be continuous from the past. Now, at the same time, when one thinks of this phrase, the uncontemporaneity of the contemporaneous, actually, this masks two things. The first is an ideological statement about what ought to be contemporaneous and what ought not to be, what is modern and what isn't. And the second is an oxymoron, because, of course, if something is around, it is by definition contemporaneous. It's here, it exists in the world. But this phrase was coined by Bloch when trying to explain or to define or talk about the growth of fascism in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, and the appearance of what appeared to be striking a throwback, a regression to previous primitive ways of thought, ideological, cultural attitudes in Europe. And of course, if you look at Nazi anti-Semitism, the ultimate roots of this in old Christian traditions of anti-Semitism in Europe are very clear. At the same time, it is also apparent to any serious historian that fascism itself was an entirely modern product. It was the product of modern society. It was the product of modern economy, economic change, and reactions against it. It's the product, above all, of modern party organization. The form it gave to anti-Semitism had old roots, but was very new at the same time, and of course even more evil. And in terms of the party organization of fascism, of course, this also owed a great deal to the example of communism, which was one of the two great modernizing, ideologically modernizing forces in the modern world, along with liberal capitalism. The modernity of fascism was brought home to me a number of years ago when I described the MQM in Karachi as a modern party. This caused outrage among some of my Pakistani liberal interlocutors because they said, how can you describe it as a modern party? It's chauvinist, it's extremist, it's fascist. To which the reply is, once again, what is unmodern about fascism? I will come to this a little later in my remarks when it comes to Narendra Modi and the BJP in India. Now, the first thing, of course, the first way in which South Asian politics, following on from Modi and the BJP, defied one of the key Weberian criteria for modernity is the enduring power of religion. Religion in itself, religion in society and culture, but also religion in politics. And this, of course, has long been apparent to certainly most people working on South Asia, but it has been quite striking the degree to which, at the same time, there have been efforts to downplay the importance of religion, or, of course, to render it in terms which are quasi-Marxian, but which are being used by people who are not Marxists, but in fact liberal modernizers, to explain it away as a form of false consciousness. The opium of the people, a means used by political elites or political entrepreneurs to mobilize populations. Now, of course, there is a good deal of truth in this, but equally, I mean, they are doing so on the basis of a deep reality in society. And one which, as I say, defies the standard versions of modernization deriving ultimately, in academia at least, to a great extent, from Max Weber. By the way, as an aside, another area, referring to my work on American nationalism, where one meets the most ferocious opposition to the study of religion and religion in politics, is in the United States itself. I mean, on the part of, even strikingly, in other ways, intelligent, far-sighted, deep thinkers like Michael Mann, for example, but the categorical unwillingness to admit the importance of religion in American society, in American political behavior, American attitudes, can only, it seems to me, stem from the fact that among these people there is an absolutely deep-seated belief, both in modernization, but also in the United States as the forefront of modernization. This does not mean that such people are not often very critical of the United States, but this monolithic view of modernization in the world more or less requires, at least unconsciously, a reduction in the importance of religion or the explanation away of religion as essentially something else, as not deeply rooted, as not representing a real and to some extent continuous force. Now, this leads to the overall thrust of what we're talking about in the course of this conference from many different angles and, of course, with many different views and attitudes. But I think, not just in our region, the Indian Ocean region, but more widely, it should be apparent that neither modernity, as defined by Weber, or indeed post-modernity, as defined by Frederick Jameson and others, has led, as they predicted, well, Weber not, because he sort of came before that in a way, to a homogenized global culture or a homogenized global political culture. One can talk about this existing at a somewhat superficial formal level in terms of the almost universal formal acceptance today of the idea of popular sovereignty, of sovereignty as lying in the people. This, of course, is required by two things. One is modern mass society and the abolition of formal legal distinctions between classes, the things that Tocqueville talked about in the mid-19th century. The move from a traditional society in which people were not just practically unequal in power, but were legally unequal in status and power before the law. That has gone. The other thing required by popular sovereignty is, of course, the nation state. Except in those cases where sovereignty is still formally derived from God, the only place which sovereignty can derive from in a nation state is the people of that state, however defined. But of course, as we see from all these states which have popular sovereignty enshrined in their constitutions, what this means in practice can be very, very different. And is very different across most of the world. And part of what has, I think, complicated and hampered academic discussion of this has been two things. One is, of course, academic compartmentalization. Not just the relentless pressure on area studies from the rational choice theorists and others, who continue to wage this pretty, ferocious and consistent struggle throughout much of academia against those of us engaged in these studies. But also, and this is where Professor Blum-Hansen's work is so valuable, Chandanav's work is so valuable, and other people represented here. This tendency, of course, of political science not to talk to the anthropologists, people not talking to the historians, everybody retreating into their departments, even when, in fact, they are working on things which require infusions, insights, information from all these different spheres simultaneously. And, one sees, I'm sorry to say, when it comes to the study of kinship in South Asia, statements by some of the political scientists which have a view of kinship so crude that it is in fact only a straw man, which they use in order to not in order to understand kinship, but in order to dismiss it as a serious factor of importance. Sometimes this becomes quite explicit. There is a fine work of anthropology on the Gujar landowners of Attock, and one of and their use of patronage politics, obviously shading heavily over into corruption. And this was actually attacked by one reviewer on the explicit grounds that by analysing this and by talking of its stability through time, of its continuity, its likely perpetuation into the future, this was legitimizing corruption. In other words, if we don't talk about corruption, it will go away. We should, the ostrich approach, a most extraordinarily frank statement, I thought. The other thing which has, of course, hampered some of these studies, and which certainly has, I think, visibly diminished the number of anthropologists working on political themes and political anthropology is the Orientalist critique or anti-Orientalist critique. The old anthropology was serving imperial power, but also that the study of political culture and political traditions always risks coming under the critique of essentializing the subject, of somehow that Johnny Chinaman or Johnny Pathan behaves in certain ways, always had and always will. Well, now, of course, there is a central problem about anthropological studies, that they are by definition a snapshot of a society at a given time. But, and here of course is why one needs the infusion of the other disciplines as well. Anthropologists today are perfectly aware of this problem, and certainly no serious anthropologist today dreams of talking of a given society as unchanging, as unaffected by modern patterns, the impact of modern change. The funny thing about these critiques as well is that they themselves, in many ways, rest on an implicit essentialization closely related to this ideological belief in modernity, in modernization, which, whether stated or unstated, is also a modernization seen as shaped fundamentally by Western ideas. An attitude given its most famous or infamous form by Tony Blair's statement that throughout history people have wanted freedom and have understood freedom in the same way. An intellectually grotesque statement, but one which actually unconsciously has surprising resonance, including in parts of academia. Related to a teleology, the teleology of what has been called getting to Denmark, getting to a Western democratic, now capitalist, in the past socialist, or capitalist market, social market economy, which then, as Fukuyama says, essentially remains the same forever. You get there and you stay there forever. And this, I don't think I'm setting up a straw man myself here, because this is the underlying ideology, quite explicitly very often, of Western governmental aid organizations, NGOs, unofficial NGOs, and of course, to a degree, therefore, of everybody who receives their money and is influenced by them. And as the Spanish say, Mr. Money is a powerful gentleman in shaping these attitudes. So a soft, unstated version of Fukuyama's end of history. And of course, then in turn, in the eyes of the US elites, associated with agreement with US policy and US power. And I could sum this up with numerous anecdotes from my unhappy time in the world of policy. But I always remember an exasperated American official asking me once, when talking about, corruption and authoritarian legacies in Russia in the 1990s, when is Russia going to become a normal country? And I said to him, what do you mean by a normal country? And he said, well, I mean a normal country like the United States, at which point I could not resist a hoot of laughter, when it comes to the specific features of American political culture, which have become more and more apparent with time. But then he said, well, a normal country like Britain, at which point I hooted even more loudly, knowing something of the peculiarities of my own political tradition and country. And then he got really exasperated, and he said, look, you know perfectly well what I mean. I mean a normal country like New Zealand or Denmark. To which the reply is, I think you will probably have to wait a very, very long time before Russia becomes like New Zealand or Denmark. But in addition, of course, the main thing is that as we see now in the West, in the United States, in Denmark, this is not a fixed target. History does not come to an end. The West itself is developing in a pluriform way, which does not, by any means, of course, indicate that it is developing in a good way or a way that one has to like, but it is certainly not developing in a conformist, uniform way. Something else that follows from this, I think quite obviously, is the need to abandon or at least very heavily qualify two things. The first is not just the idea of a clear divide or opposition between democracy and authoritarianism, but also this idea of a clear and fixed spectrum between the two, with pure democracy at one end and some kind of pure authoritarianism at the other. The thing that is enshrined in the reports of Freedom House on freedom in the world, the reports of Freedom House being treated in turn not just as a kind of science, but as a kind almost of dogma, of proven science by the US media, for example, or not just the US media, European media, which quotes these all the time about where is a country on this fixed spectrum. Things to me today look much more like a cloud or nebula. Not just in that people are situated at very different points in different ways, but also that they move around, that they do not remain fixed. They circle, well, they don't just circle, they do ellipses. The other thing, of course, now there are other ways of looking at this which can be almost equally schematic, rather than democracy, authoritarianism, strong and weak states, strong state, weak society. But I think what one sees in South Asia is, but reflecting, I think, a wider pattern in the world in general, including in the West, is a much more variegated and complicated picture. South Asia, of course, contains at its core India, the world's largest democracy, and a country where democratic institutions, ways of behavior, organizations, have been consolidated for a long time, are deeply rooted, and look stable. Democracy today seems to be consolidating in Pakistan to a degree and along different lines. And as part of this process, you do indeed see the growth of powerful political parties with strong democratic appeal and legitimacy. But various other things are also apparent. Firstly, in terms of structure, ideology and practice, these parties most certainly very often do not conform to liberal hopes, whether Western liberal hopes or Asian political hopes. Aisha Jalal long since drew attention to the authoritarian practices of both the Indian and the Pakistani states, to a considerable extent independently of whether those states at the time were ruled by democratic or military governments, or rather when Pakistan was ruled by a military government, because, amongst other things, of the way in which post-independence governments, of course, relied on the institutions of colonialism to maintain public order and to consolidate the newly independent states. But this is not just a question of democratic political parties relying on those familiar straw men or dead horses or whatever, the authoritarian military, the civil service, the police. It's also a question of the political parties themselves being to a considerable extent permeated by authoritarian attitudes towards society and towards the exercise of power. Obviously, the most powerful political party in Pakistan today, the Pakistan Muslim League, led by the Sharif brothers, a party which which has won elections generally, legally, on the whole, a party with real democratic legitimacy and public support. But after Shahbaz came back as Chief Minister of Punjab, I asked one of his voters, actually I got much the same response from several voters, about the fact that encounter killings, extrajudicial executions, had soared under Shahbaz, under the new PMLN government. And he looked at me and he said, but he takes real care to make sure that only the right people get shot. And this was a democratic voter, you understand. You know, this was not a wicked policeman or military character. So it's also not a question of just of wicked elites imposing this kind of attitude on the population. And in this context, I don't want to anticipate what Chandana will say later, but I would draw attention to Chandana's fascinating work on Sargodha and on the ways in which different kinds of political behavior, political structure, coexist simultaneously. How here, I think, and by no means just when it comes to studying South Asian politics, one must be deeply suspicious of academic tendencies to parsimoniousness, as it's called, or to put it more harshly, monocausal explanations and pictures. Just as it would be completely mistaken now in Pakistani politics to leave out the importance of political parties and their role, but so it would be completely mistaken to suggest that in many cases these are the kind of organized political parties which can essentially impose their own candidates on society. Chandana has drawn attention to the fact that lacking this kind of organization, they have to work through mediators, through local big men, if you like, you know, who, but who also are not the kind of somewhat mythical or mythologized feudals of the past. They don't give orders and say, vote for me. They have to win the vote. How do they win the vote? Well, to a great extent by extracting patronage from society and also providing protection against the forces of the state. And these patterns look stable, relatively stable, and long-lasting. There is no great sign that these are going to go away. And, of course, the other thing to note about the PMLN, like most, though not all of the Pakistani political parties, is that it is, of course, a dynastic party. It is not an organized political party. It depends ultimately on one family, as do the Bhutto Zardaris and the Wali Khan dynasty in the Pashtun areas. This means, of course, that it is subject in part to the kind of things that Ibn Khaldun talked about 700 years ago, you know, the decay of families, the inevitable, you know, running out of political energy. And also, of course, so it's vulnerable to dynastic exhaustion or to dynastic split. But also, of course, the power of the dynasty means that in many ways it cannot develop as an organized political party, because an organized cadre party would precisely, at some stage, or it might, challenge the dynastic power of the party leaders. The power of the party, but certainly not according to at least standard Western precepts. Now, next door in India, you do have a very powerful cadre party, which is in many ways achieving what have been stated to be key goals of modernization. One of them is, you know, you have a powerful party relying on a nationalist ideology. It can do unpopular things when it comes to economic reform. It can demand sacrifices of the population. It can compel things, the Kemalist model, if you like, from Turkey. The other thing is that it can defeat local forces rooted in kinship or some kind of separate quasi-ethnic group within society, as the BJP is now doing. But, of course, first, who are the cadres? As has often been said, this is not, in fact, a BJP party, this is an RSS party now, under Modi. The ruthless discipline, and it is an impressive discipline, has been provided, of course, by a group which in its origins was explicitly anti-democratic. Now that is not quite true anymore. It's dedicated to winning elections, but clearly elements of this culture remain. But secondly, of course, this is a nationalist party with a religious version of nationalism, deeply rooted in forms of religion, which once again modernity was supposed to abolish over time. This brings me to my final point. Obviously, the roots of the BJP in Hinduism are obvious and cannot be ignored. Equally, obviously, Hinduism is an ancient religion with a sort of core set of beliefs and practices which are very ancient indeed. But here, of course, it would be equally absurd to ignore the fact that the BJP RSS, it's not just that they come out of, but they themselves have shaped a form of political Hinduism. I feel quite shy saying this in front of Professor Blum-Hansen, but I don't think he would disagree with me, which is, of course, in many ways, in fact, in most ways, modern. It is a modern creation. At the same time, to say that it's a modern creation is not to say that it's a new creation, because, of course, this is something which people have been working on in India now for almost 150 years. In the process, something has happened which one might call hilarious if it didn't have some rather grim and depressing aspects about it as well. Islam is supposed to be the great, monolithic, scripturally based religion, held together by scripture, by legal codes, and so forth. And since the Iranian Revolution, certainly since 9/11, of course, security circles, policy circles, all the academic circles in the West associated with them have been obsessed with the threat of political Islam and political Islam taking over, as it has, of course, done in certain areas. Islamic revolution in Pakistan. Actually, of course, the Islamic, or Islamist, rather, political parties in Pakistan today, in the past, and, well, not forever, perhaps, but certainly it looks like for some considerable time to come, are electorally very weak. And one of the reasons for this is, of course, that they are so divided among themselves. And one of the reasons why they are so divided among themselves is, of course, that Pakistani Islam is profoundly divided into different traditions, different sects. I'm not saying that will be true forever, by no means. One can, of course, see very determined efforts being made to change that, but one can also see very determined efforts pushing back against it. Meanwhile, what is the great religion of all religions, which was supposed to be so diverse, so utterly fragmented, so incapable of unity, so lacking in tight scriptural authority, and certainly incapable of generating any kind of, tight political movement? Well, that is, of course, Hinduism, which has been celebrated for its diversity, not just by Westerners, but by Indians themselves, notably by Jawaharlal Nehru, for example. And yet, it is Hinduism in India, a modern form of political Hinduism in India, and not Pakistan, which has generated a ruthless cadre party with an ideology based on a modern, monolithic view of its own religion. The only thing which is funnier than that, of course, is the fact that in many ways, for the past 150 years, these forces in Hinduism have been reacting against and trying to struggle against Islam and Christianity, by the way, while trying at the same time to make Hinduism as like Islam as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've allowed you more time than normal, but the topics and the discussions, the paper that you presented is so intriguing and so insightful that I'm sure you share with me that it was worthwhile allowing Anatol to speak for a little more than the time allows. And now, and I'm sure you will also have a number of questions that you want to raise, because he did come up with some very insightful points, and also maybe controversial to some of you. So feel free to ask questions later on. Now we move to the next speaker, and we have Dr. Sharath Srinivasan from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Sharath is a director of the University of Cambridge Center of Governance and Human Rights, and he's also the David Elaine Potter Lecturer in Department of Politics and International Studies. He's also a fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and co-founded and also director of the African Voices Foundation. Dr. Srinivasan has published a number of books, especially in Sudan, South Sudan, and his recent book that he's working on is called When Peace Kills Politics. It's going to be published soon by Hearst and the University of Oxford, I believe. Has it been published? Not yet. It's in the process. So we have Dr. Srinivasan will be talking to us about gatekeeping and broadcasting in digital age, state and power in East Asia. In East Africa, sorry.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm going to start with an additional quote to add to the Bloch quote, which is William Faulkner, a favorite quote of Hannah Arendt, not talking about things dissimilar to the global sources of fascism and totalitarianism, which is that the past is never dead. In fact, it is not even past. Now, a quote which means a lot in understanding the incontemporaneity of the contemporaneous. But of course, Africa, which I will focus on and I focus on in my work, has often been thought of to have no past. This is a dark continent, for Hegel, the land of childhood, a place without history. And of course, this is really easy for us to understand now. It's well known. It allows us the contrast with modern Europe as storied, as mature, as liberal, that needed not just an Oriental other, but an African other, which is not so much about the ossification of tradition as much as about the primitive, the savage, etc. And if there's, and this is perhaps my only strongest link to the theme of the Indian Ocean in what will follow, but if there's one part of the sub-Saharan Africa in particular that speaks to enormous amount of history and storied interconnection, interaction, and vibrant exchange, etc., it's the East African littoral, all the way from the Horn down south. And so, in a sense, relocating East Africa and the Horn of Africa within its much longer history and heritage of interconnections across the Indian Ocean is very important. Not least of all because now, with the growing rise of the Indian Ocean, it has a major influence on trajectories in that part of the continent. So I focus on East Africa and to some extent the Horn, and I'm particularly interested at the moment in, in digital communications and the kind of impact on political change that digital communications have in store for this part of the world. In a sense, it's a work in progress, and what I'm going to focus on today is teasing out some of the lines of analysis and possible arguments that are going to flow from this work. And my basic premise really is that when our starting point for firstly the nature of the state, and secondly for the role of communication technologies in politics is very different than for the liberal West, the implications of the digital revolution for politics need a very different framework of understanding. And it's both of those two things, the nature of the state and the nature of the communications landscape, that are markedly different in this part of the world. In sub-Saharan Africa and the East and Horn of Africa that I focus on, we have to engage with African specificities, in particular regarding how authority and the exercise of control by the state have been historically constituted and practiced. And then secondly, how this happens within a context of an absence of self-financing by the state, which has had to resort to other strategies of accumulation to fund their longevity or even their survival. And finally, how African governments and regimes in control of the state have had to manage mobilization and legitimacy amidst competing sources of identity and political authority within society. And these elements play out very differently then in understanding the role of communications and change in shifting trajectories of the state. With very different starting points, we begin to tease out different consequences of the digital revolution for states in Africa. My interest then is in states in which the bureaucratic state is formative and has struggled to emancipate itself from elite capture and patronage, in which accumulation has often depended on strategies of extroversion, focused on external actors rather than domestic taxation and rents, and in which political mobilization depends heavily on subnational and ethnic associational life rather than stable party organization. And so if that's a sort of a different context of the state and politics, then I think the other startlingly obvious thing about the digital communications revolution in this part of the world is that it proceeds from a very different starting point than it does in the liberal West as well. So analyses of the impact of the internet and digital communications are on the back of, in Europe and the United States, etc., an existing complex communications landscape, mass media, and other forms of communication that are extensive. We're talking about a part of the world where landline telephony was like 1% to 2% penetration before the onset of mobile communications. So the transformations are very profound from a very different starting point. I think, having said that, the other foundational remarks is about the fact that when we think of the states in this part of the world after the liberal state, we're really not talking about an idea or even a practice that took much hold and root in this part of the world before the decline of liberalism, which we might all identify now. Whether we're talking about Kenya or Ethiopia, Eritrea or Somalia, countries which I'm interested to focus on with this work. In all cases, the extent to which the liberal story in its zenith after the end of the Cold War had an influence on practices within the state was very, very limited. In Kenya, we certainly had a move to multi-party democracy after 2002 and the opening up of the political space. But largely, this is a relatively uninterrupted story of patronage and clientelism dominating politics, such that even when party politics opened up, it was ethnic bloc voting and minimum voting coalitions around ethnic alliances that dominated politics, and the state itself very much still continued to operate with the classics of logics of clientelism in play. I won't detail more necessarily about Ethiopia and Eritrea and Somalia, but again, we're talking about countries in which, in lots of senses, the liberal zenith passed these states by. Certainly Eritrea, in terms of achieving its independence and being set on a different trajectory from 94, but fundamentally one that immediately put itself at odds with a kind of liberal transformational project if it was coming from the outside. Ethiopia, one long history of dominant regimes in control of the state, from feudal empires to Stalinist regimes, and then the Marxist developmentalism of the current regime. A moment of opening up the political space in 2005 that was quickly clamped down again. But fundamentally, we're not really talking about after the liberal state as a dominant idea or practice, rather just one that passed by a whole region of the world. Somalia, a much more complicated story, but let me keep moving. And the point there is just that the liberal state as a touchstone for understanding what these states are not is and has been a waste of time. It really has not got us very far to understanding what these states are about in their details. But nevertheless, I think we can take some insights from the way in which analysis and theorization of the impact of the internet and communication, digital communications from Europe and North America can help us understand what's going on potentially on the continent. And I want to just highlight one of a few authors who I think are very important for this analysis, and that's the work, especially because of this panel and its interest in Weber and the alternatives, I guess, to Weber, thinking about the state. And that's the work of Bruce Bimber, who quite explicitly took on this question of political organization in the age of the internet and has for quite a long time. And his basic argument is that really what matters to this information revolution of the late 20th century, this fourth information revolution as he characterized it, is information abundance and how that leads to post-bureaucratic forms of political organization. So political organizations as intermediaries and their bureaucratic forms reflected a context where information was scarce, was costly, and unevenly available to political actors. And it enabled political organizations to achieve certain things in terms of both associational structures, but then also the use and production of knowledge that comes from that helped them to articulate representational forms or to act on behalf of groups of people, etc., in ways that otherwise they could not themselves. So the internet then, as an age of information abundance, changes these logics, and he discusses them in quite a lot of detail. The implications of channels for communication from elites to the populace opening up very widely, the low cost of information and the ability to mine that to find out more about the population, the rapid increase in communication between citizens, etc., is that political association pluralizes and also fragments markedly. But that also bureaucratic organization is no longer in a particularly advantageous or comparatively powerful position. From that, I think, specifically thinking about Weber and bureaucracy, the core of Weber's arguments around bureaucracy, that's one aspect of his idea of the modern state, is information scarcity and the ability for expert knowledge to be built up through bureaucratic forms that enables forms of administration. Now, he actually looked indeed in his own limited way, to the Indian Ocean, to Egypt, to Persia, to Asia, to look at the forms of communication that enabled administrative states to emerge. So in a sense, he was trying, to some extent, to move outside of the European framework to understand these very processes of administrative states emerging. But the core of this is, of course, that expert knowledge is crucial to the form of decision-making that bureaucratic organization allows. And expert knowledge itself is a product of information scarcity. Now, the implications for this in the African context, I think, are slightly different, very different to the way that Bimber talks about post-bureaucratic political organization in the United States. Because here we're talking about weak or quasi-bureaucratic states in the first place, so it's not the challenge to bureaucratic organization that is coming. Rather, it's the ability for the digital communications to bring about more supplies of information that first allows more affordances towards forms of bureaucratic organization rather than less. But the problem is that the state is competing with non-state actors in terms of the capability and expert knowledge to amass this kind of information and do things with it. And we see this then in the way in which the state becomes adept at outsourcing the provision of public goods to non-state actors and commercial actors in this part of the world, whether it's around electricity provision or education, health provision, etc. The state plays a role in enabling and licensing third-party actors to perform these functions. But the other side of it is that new associational life and pluralism is indeed a threat and a challenge to these states, especially the ones in the Horn. So the clamping down on the space for communication becomes increasingly prominent in these parts of the world. Now, for me, to take some of the ways of thinking about the transformations brought about by the digital, but to think of them from the point of view of where African states start in the first place, demands that we look at the kind of scholarship on African politics that has dominated and to see where its limits lie. And I am particularly interested in taking two pieces of work, one by Jeffrey Herbst and a prominent piece of work on states and power in Africa, in which he identifies the challenge of broadcasting power as the main problem of consolidating state authority in the continent. And the other work by Frederick Cooper, where he talks about gatekeeping and the role of states, post-colonial state, in maximizing its ability to gatekeep external actors' access to the sovereign state as a way of accumulating rents. Now, for Herbst, he points to the fundamental challenge of state consolidation in Africa compared to Europe, and he's using a Tillian-style framework, a Charles Tillian-style framework here, which is that it's very, very difficult to project power over distance. And that continues to remain the enduring challenge in the region in understanding the problems of state consolidation. So an abundance of land, low density of population, low surplus production, fluid population movements, and always the option of exit means that control over territory and population through centralized authority is inherently difficult. Now, at the core of this is a communication sort of challenge, in effect, right, which is that it's very hard to build the physical infrastructures of communication to project authority from central state location. But for Herbst, this idea of broadcasting power, which is the way that he frames this analysis and the problems of broadcasting power, is really focused on control over the legitimate use of violence. That's that other side of the Weberian analysis or framework. In a sense, then, communications only plays a functional role as supporting the ability to deploy and state control over the use of legitimate violence. In that sense, he writes off the communications infrastructure as a source of informational exchange that is about also legitimate authority and the way in which the state relates to citizens and to society. And in his later work, he sort of dismissed the problem of the question of the digital as saying that's a problem to be managed for African states rather than something that's inherently going to change their trajectory. And I guess my interest is that's actually probably to undermine or to diminish the significance of what's going on with digital communications because he's so heavily focused on coercive control rather than on the ways in which, when we think of the Weberian state, information and communication play other roles in bureaucratic forms of expert knowledge, but also in forms of control that are based on surveillance rather than just on pure use of force. And I think if we look at Cooper's idea of the gatekeeper state, which is particularly illuminating of the problem that face post-colonial states in terms of most of their access to their longevity coming from accruing rents from the relationship with international actors in terms of trade, etc., rather than domestically, and navigating that gatekeeping role in the capital. We can see that there is a value in thinking about the problems of accumulation in particular that face the post-colonial state as relating to its weak sources of internal taxation and revenue raising. So with those taken together, my interest then is, well, how are some of these playing out in different ways because of digital communications? And I found that at least some elements in the countries that I've listed before that are of interest, very different directions in the way that things are going. So in terms of authority and control, this is a couple of just, I guess, examples and snippets that just to give a sense of why I think things are working out quite differently. In Kenya, about 5 years ago, there was a set of attacks in different parts of the country. They were attributed to al-Shabaab elements from Somalia, in the capital, in other parts of the country. And one occurred in a ethnic Somali-dominated part of Nairobi, Eastleigh. And the immediate response of the Kenyan government, I think spoken to some of the people involved in the communications ministry, was to try and understand whether there was an indication of who was responsible by looking at communications data. And so the Kenyan government has full access to the, obviously to social media, but also to mobile communications data through the main one of the main telecommunications operators, Vodafone's subsidiary Safaricom. And it also has a close relationship with IBM, who have lots of commercial operations in the country and also have the first research lab on the continent based in Nairobi. And they quickly brought in IBM to do the data analysis using its sophisticated sort of algorithmic capabilities to analyze all social media exchanges around the time and identify a particular set of messages that they targeted. Someone who left a message saying, I think it was, it was text speak for 8 dead, good job, or something like that. It was something as obscure as that. But they found this, and then they went and swept in and arrested this person. But speaking to some of the people involved, that as far as the Kenyan government's concerned, the license to operate for IBM, in effect, in the country is that it's also able to give over some of its capabilities with big data analysis, etc., to the needs and interests of the Kenyan state, especially as regards surveillance. And a similar approach is taken to the mobile network operators. So in a sense, the ability for the state to exercise and project control through its relationship with third parties, acting as a gatekeeper and providing a license to operate, is ways in which the state has found new means to exercise control and that are not necessarily directly built on its capabilities, but it's on its ability to play its sovereignty card for giving access to markets in order for other actors to support its interests in projecting authority. In terms of accumulation, I think these are just snippet examples, but another example that's of interest is the way that the Eritrean state has, in which there's a high flow of, and as in Somalia, a high flow of remittances into the country, has been able to tax the flows of remittances increasingly and more effectively, including there is a sort of a tax that applies to the diaspora generally, but through digital transactions. So digital transactions have enabled accumulation to occur much more effectively around remittances than they did before. So you see the state finding new opportunities to accumulate, again, externally focused, but in this case on the diaspora, through digital communications. And I think that's equally the case internally as well. You see, in particular in Kenya, but also Ethiopia, but real innovations around taxation that are often outsourced to third parties that are enabling the Kenyan state to collect taxes internally in ways that it never could before because it didn't have the bureaucratic capability. And finally, in terms of mobilization and legitimacy, I think that's the area that's most uncertain in terms of the ways in which it's playing out in terms of alternative sources of political organization and authority utilizing digital communications in ways that are sources of anxiety for dominant regimes, but also dominant regimes using these capabilities to mobilize. So in particular, again in Kenya, the current ruling coalition's capability of mobilizing through digital technologies and including very creative uses of WhatsApp in order to propagate messages to different particular target communities and using the networks of different communities that those sorts of social media provide is enabling it to mobilize in new ways. But it doesn't have a monopoly on those sorts of capabilities. And in the absence of that monopoly in countries like Ethiopia and Eritrea, they're clamping down on that space of digital exchange of information flows is the only solution. So it's a sort of a gatekeeping role, again, that comes into play. So for me, some tentative directions that come from this in terms of what kinds of conclusions we might be starting to reach. I think the first is that state coercive control and power is actually enhanced by digital communication. So the coercive capacity of the state is enhanced, whether that's, and this is as much about outsourcing and the ability to gatekeep access to the sovereign state in order for the return of other capabilities of third parties to enable that to happen. But it's also about the relative enhancement of the state's capacity to surveil and produce bureaucratic knowledge that matters. So compared to where it was coming from, this is allowing for new state-building capacity in important ways. There are new modes and opportunities for accumulation, ranging from digital taxation infrastructures to gatekeeping access to emerging markets and taxing global remittance flows. And I think that's already very clear. But I think that the problem of pluralism, as Bimber identified, it remains. There's a real uncertainty around connectivity and what it might lead to, and it's to the benefit of diverse political organizational forms. So in the case of constructing national identities and national belonging and mobilizing around more collective identities, that proves to be very problematic and dangerous. And thus we see states like Ethiopia in particular very much clamping down on the space for that plurality and utilizing a hold on communications infrastructure to spread particular nationalist ideology down to, all the way down to district level. So it's much more controlling the infrastructure in order to do that. My hope is that with this, in the end, consolidating all of this and with further empirical analysis, that the perspective on what the digital does to transforming politics is seen in a new and different light from Africa. So it's not just about understanding these processes in East Africa for their own sake, but because they actually shed light on how the digital transforms politics in other parts of the world, because the different starting point in the African context shows these trajectories operating in different and important ways. We shall see if that comes out in the wash. But thank you for your time.